The Tarim mummies are a collection of mummified remains from the Tarim Basin area of northwestern China. And there is over 300 of these exceptionally preserved bodies. The preservation on these bodies is so good that we can see tattoos, we can see the style and makeup of their clothing, the fibers are well preserved, and even foodstuffs and grave goods are extremely well preserved, so much so that one of the mummies even has a necklace made of chunks of cheese around their neck, and another of the mummies has an abdominal injury that has been stitched shut. Obviously, whatever they did didn't work, but you can still see the stitches in the skin of this mummy. Now, these are naturally preserved mummies rather than embalmed Egyptian-style mummies, because the area that they are in is so arid and so dry, and there's also extremely high salt content in the soil, that everything was preserved. And one of the first things that was noticed about these mummies when they were discovered, and they range from 4,000 years old to more recent, first and second century BCE, is that some of them have red hair, and some of them have blonde hair, and some of them have lighter brown hair, and some of them have very Caucasoid features, and some of their clothing and their fibers use techniques that were more associated with the West and Western Europe than China. So people were fascinated by these mummies from the start, but they came up against a problem. And the problem is that these mummies were found in the Uyghur Xinjiang Autonomous Region. And the Uyghur people believe that that's their land natively, that they were there long before the Chinese came in the 17th century and laid claim to the land. And this has led to independence movements, separatist acts, and crackdowns by the Chinese government that allegedly have included ethnic cleansing and retaliation. So these mummies, when they were found, became part of the Uyghur national identity. They felt that these were their ancestors, and in fact they adopted one of the mummies, the Beauty of Loudon, as their symbolic ancestress. There's a paper that I reference in the slides where she goes into the entirety of this cultural identity that the Uyghur people develop with the mummies, and how they build a cultural identity and a cultural rallying point around who these mummies are. Now, because of this, and because their beliefs run strictly counter to the Chinese government, for the longest time the Chinese government refused to allow any DNA testing on these mummies, even though they were found in the first mummies were found in the earliest 20th century. So we had mummies in time to do DNA testing. When DNA testing started becoming a thing, the mummies were available, and yet the Chinese government wouldn't allow it to happen. And so without DNA testing, we had no way of knowing who these mummies were actually related to. And a researcher called Victor H. Mayer, who is a language and literature professor, saw the mummies. And in fact, when he first saw the mummies, he looked at them and said, they're fake. These have been fake. They're too good. They're too well preserved. And no, they weren't. They were real. So he really set out to solve the mystery of who these mummies were. And supposedly in 1993, He was on an expedition authorized by the Chinese government to go and take DNA samples from some of the mummies. But evidently at the last minute, the Chinese government decided no, he couldn't have those samples. Theoretically, anecdotally, another Chinese official slipped him half a dozen of the vials and said, here you go. And these were taken out of China and were looked at by an Italian researcher. Now, I could not find any place where these results were actually published as a scientific paper. The only evidence I could find of the actual testing of these results was in a thing called the Sino-Platonic Papers from January 2000, reviewing a monograph in the Journal of Indo-European Studies that's actually edited by Mayer, called The Bronze Age and Early Iron Age Peoples of East Central Asia. And it is a section of that where the Italian researcher talks about the results. But again, as far as I can tell, the results from this smuggled DNA were never formally scientifically published, which is a really interesting thing. It's a quandary. Where did those results go? How did were those results ever peer reviewed? Those results suggested a European origin to the mummies, but the consequence of this was that the Chinese locked down on DNA testing again and would not let anybody but Chinese researchers do tests. Now, that was done, there were tests done in 2007 by a Chinese group with a National Geographic team that was doing a documentary. And they found some results. They found admixing. There was another study that found some European and Siberian and Asian origins. And the Uyghur people really still maintained the Tarim mummies as a cultural identity and rallied around it. But the political controversy over these mummies kept going. At one point, the University of Pennsylvania Museum was supposed to be hosting the mummies and artifacts. And then all of a sudden, the mummies weren't going to be there. And it wasn't discussion between museum curators. It was discussion between governments, between the US government and the Chinese government had to negotiate. And you have to wonder if, Mayer's existence as a professor at the university and as a associate of the museum was one of the things that the Chinese government was concerned about. And how do you deal with that? What do you do when an archaeologist has pissed off a government? That's one of those ethical questions right there, is do you separate that individual from the science so that the science can get done, or from the museum so that the museum has the right to show things. Then from there, we have these ethical questions. We have these concerns about, does science and archaeology have a moral obligation to conduct science, against the wishes of a government if it supports an indigenous group that's being subjugated or ethnically cleansed? Or does does the archaeologist have an ethic duty to stay the heck out of it and focus strictly on the science and just say, I can't think about what the results of my work might mean on a socio-political level. I need to just do the science. At what point is it appropriate to try and smuggle DNA results or conduct experiments against the wishes of one political social group when another political social group wants it? It loops back a little bit to Kennewick Man, and with remains that old, when does it become part of the modern culture? When does that overlap? And then you have concerns about the validity of the science. If a restrictive, isolationist, information controlling government is the only people allowed to do the science, can you trust those results, or do you demand access by other people, by neutral parties, or is there even really a neutral party? And what about the scientists having to work within those restrictions? You can't assume they're all, towing the party line, and that they're not worried about their own ethical concerns within parameters that they may feel are stifling their science and stifling their expression of scientific facts. We found X, Y, and Z. And as these as these tests were going on, and they were finding admixture, they were finding Siberian population, they were finding Eastern Asian population, we obviously had some sort of mixing happening in the Tarim Basin. But it was also that they were looking at a lot of the older the newer skeletons. They were looking at doing DNA testing on a lot of the newer mummies. And when you've got 300 plus specimens to work with that range from 4,000 years old to first century, that's a lot of space to work with. So you really do have to narrow it down. So that's where we were until very recently. And then there was a plot twist. So there was so much speculation about where this population had come from. And were they Tocharian speakers? Were they predominantly Eastern Asian? Were they, Westerners that had, come across the Silk Road? Who were these people? And then a really significant research paper came out in 2021. It was a multi-facility study, including the Max Planck Institute, including Harvard, including 2 different Chinese universities, and they looked at 13 of the oldest Tarim mummies and found something completely and totally unexpected. That was not what they were expecting at all. And what they found was that these mummified remains, these oldest mummified remains, and they were looking at ones between 4,100 and 3,700 years ago. They compared the data to ancient and modern genomes and compared that to the 3 big hypotheses. That it was a group from the West that had migrated. And that was really, all 3 proposals were that there was, it was 3 different areas of the West, but that was the main idea, that these were people who had migrated, hundreds of miles to the area. And what the results showed was that the answer to that was no for any of those. Instead, what they found was that the earliest mummies were actual direct descendants of an indigenous Ice Age population from northern Eurasia about 9,000 years ago. like the end of the last Ice Age is when these people, this population disappears from the record. And for these early mummies, there was none of that Western ancestry. And as the main researcher for this study says, she's like, well, that's one question answered, but one mystery and many, many more. Because how did this population become so genetically isolated until later? Especially when their grave goods and their clothing and their physical appearance shows influence from other surrounding groups, that they got these cultural elements, but they didn't intermix with them. They didn't admix with them. The wealth of material available from Tarim is pretty impressive, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what else comes out of the area.